This will be a positive conversation.
I teach positivity, positive psychology
At Johns Hopkins.
at Johns Hopkins.
So I've already recorded your intro, your bio, the whole thing. That's already done. So what I'll do,
Nice.
yeah, I love to be efficient with people's time. So what I will do is I will read the opening phrase where I say hello and welcome to another installment. I'll say I am thrilled to share the podium with Dr. Johnny Parker, and we'll go right into it. All right. Are you ready? In 3, 2, 1. Hello, and welcome to a new season of At the Podium with me, Patrick Huey. At the Podium is a multimedia platform that brings together people from a diverse background of lives, careers, and experiences, but all share one thing in common. They have stepped fully into the transformative power of finding and raising their voices to make an impact on our world today. At the Podium holds a space for people to tell their stories, to be heard, and to bring us inspiration. Today, I am thrilled to share the podium with Dr. Johnny Parker. Dr. Johnny Parker is passionate about helping people at any stage turn the page to the life, the leadership, and the business they've always wanted. Through executive coaching, seminars, and keynote presentations, he has a 25-year track record of helping hundreds of CEOs and professional athletes within the WNBA, the NBA, the NFL, and the PGA, aspiring entrepreneurs and high-performing individuals experience authentic success by viewing their life and work as a story so that they flourish in what matters most. Dr. Parker is an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University, where he teaches Introduction to Positive Psychology, which is an evidence-based approach to examine how people, leaders, businesses, and communities thrive. Principles such as grit, resilience, emotional intelligence, flourishing, happiness, and gratitude have been the X factors enabling leaders and businesses to significantly increase performance. Johnny is the author of Renovating Your Marriage Room by Room, Faith Like a Child, and Exceptional Living, 31 Exercises for Enriching Your Life, Work, and Relationships. Dr. Parker recently released his new book, Turn the Page, Unlocking the Story Within You. He holds an MA in Counseling Psychology and a doctorate in Strategic Leadership from Regent University. A native New Yorker, Dr. Parker is married to his wife and best friend, Leslyn, and they have 3 sons, JP, Jordan, and Joel, and an energetic Cocker Spaniel named JJ. The Parkers reside outside of Washington, D.C. Before we hear from Dr. Parker, I want to invite you to share at the podium with the people in your lives. If you find our conversation today valuable, and I hope you will, take a screenshot and share on your Instagram and tag at the podium _Patrick Huey. Or if you're on Facebook, share our link there. Your shares, likes, and 5-star written reviews help grow our audience and move us up the charts. I'm grateful for your support in this capacity. Okay, Dr. Parker, welcome to At the Podium.
Thank you, Patrick. I've been looking forward to this.
I'm very much looking forward to it. I read your book, which was a fantastic read. And I love the whole concept of, turning the page, creating your story, telling your story, which I know you've done a lot of work around that principle with some really high performing CEOs, with professional athletes, and there's some regular old people. So I think it's a really impactful approach to self-development, business development, community development.
Thank you. And it was definitely something that was birthed out of my own narrative, Patrick, of just when, I was turning 40 and midlife, and this narrative and the story lies, as I call it, I was telling myself. And I asked myself the question, when I've been at my best, when I've optimized and maximized my life, what was going on? And I discovered that was true for me. But then the research showed that that's true for a lot of people. And I just gave it some language.
There was a quote in the book that I really liked. It was from a gentleman named Thomas Merton, who was a Catholic monk from the Trappist order, which is, I discovered, one of the strictest orders within Catholicism. The quote is magnificent. He says, "Not all men are called to be hermits, but all men need enough silence and solitude in their lives to enable the deep inner voice to be heard, at least occasionally." This jumped out at me because we are living in a time when we're all striving. Everyone's striving to have their voices heard. We're all being told, set goals for your life, go out there and explore, lead the big life.
Yeah.
But it all starts with the quiet reflection. And sometimes that message of finding the quiet spaces gets lost in what I would call the very audible arena of modern life. And you talk about this in your book. So what are your thoughts on what the monk said?
Stillness precedes strategy. High perspective comes before high performance. And so I love that quote as well. That's why we put that in the book. But that's what I just did, Patrick, before coming on. I have a place, every leader, male, female, doesn't matter. Every person needs a place where your soul can catch its breath. Where you can go, and I call it the backstage, because as you just said, the front stage is a life of appearance, productivity, social media, technology, profitability, culture. It's all those things on the front stage, and that matters. It has its place. But I find that the story, the true and authentic narrative, is not the front stage, it's the backstage. That the front stage can be identifier, but the backstage is true identity. And that's where the story gets, that's where the true story gets emerged. And that's what Merton is getting at, that we need a place, a quiet place where we can really discern the story of who am I? What do I really want? Why do I want it? It's that Simon Sinek, know your why. And I believe that comes from our backstage.
We are very much preoccupied right now, as you said, with the front stage. I mean, everything now is really geared towards public consumption. And so that idea of what's the interior is so important, I think, to true authentic living, as you say, authentic success in your work. You talk about the authenticity of success. You also, in your work, which I really loved, was you said to the reader that when you're doing this exploration, don't be afraid to ask the big questions. And I think people are afraid of asking the big question. I know sometimes I am, because if you ask the big question, it supposes that you're going to have to respond with the answer to that big question, which may take you off of whatever path, whatever forward trajectory that you may be on.
Absolutely, it is. It can be scary, but it is a call to courageous, to being being brave. Because those big questions are questions like I just gave. Who am I? That's my identity. What do I want? Impact. Why do I want it? That's my intent. But then there's other big questions like, if what's inside of me were not to come to reality or fruition, what might the world have lost? That's a big question. What do you want me to hear that I'm not hearing in terms of communication with someone? That's a big question. That's an empathy question. And so those big questions are big questions. And you're right, they do presuppose that, okay, I got to respond. And I think it's important. And again, it goes back to that backstage, front stage deal. I find for myself, Patrick, I have to decide every day to have a meeting with me, okay? I got to have a daily meeting with me and ask these big questions. And then this is an important statement that I'm about to make as well. I got to decide when I'm backstage and I'm asking the big questions today, will I show up from love or for love? And that separates the search for validation on the front stage, because if I'm showing up for love, now I'm a predator. I'm preying on you, and I'm manipulative, and I'm controlling, and all those. I'm narcissistic when I'm showing up for love. But when I'm showing up from love, I can bless you. I can enter into your narrative, encourage, and with no strings attached.
I was in a meeting a few weeks ago, and we were discussing things that people discuss in meetings. And one of the people in the meeting with me said, we either lead from two places. We either lead from love or we lead from fear.
Wow.
Which you sort of restated, that fear, it may sometimes express itself in showing up for love, that really just focused on that whole front stage piece. So what
Yeah.
you just said resonated for me in the same space of this person in the meeting who said, we either lead from love or we lead from fear.
Absolutely.
Binary choice.
Absolutely. Very much so. Yeah.
So I was, again, reading your book, and you tell this it was a heartbreaking story to me when I read it, about your sixth grade math teacher. Her name is Mrs. Stone, and she calls you to the front of the classroom to reduce fractions. And I was like, my goodness, I haven't reduced a fraction in 30 years. I don't know if I could even answer a reducing fraction
Right.
right now.
Exactly.
But you go to the board, you're reducing the fraction, and she essentially publicly shames you for getting the answers wrong.
Yeah.
And she says to you in front of the class,
Yeah.
you don't belong in this class. And you write, and it was a gut punch for me, because you write that this became the soundtrack of your life, that you weren't good enough. And I thought, talk about empathy. I feel like I have been underestimated in my own life and my professional career from people who have said, I'm not good enough to have achieved what I've achieved. And in many ways, that feeds into the destructive narrative, what you refer to as you have said earlier, the story lies of low expectations, right? That are often the result of inherent and sometimes explicit racism within our institutions, within the negative stories that we tell ourselves. So how did that internalization of your teacher's words impact you?
That's a great question, because what happened too, you mentioned racism. I was bussed out of Jamaica, Queens to Forest Hills, and this is the mid 70s. So my class was predominantly white kids and Jewish kids, and New York, so that was my class. So I was in, and they did it. I was in 6'1". 6'1" meant that you were the smartest of the smartest. 6'2", less smart. 6'3", I don't know who thought that was a good New York school system process, but that's the way it was. So I was in the smartest of the smarts in sixth grade, and I was only one of 4 other Blacks in the class. So she called me to the board with Solomon Mincer and Bruce Moskowitz, and Solomon gets his answer right, takes a seat. Bruce gets his answer right, takes a seat. I'm alone at the board with my back, with 30 of my peers, looking at me, and I'm throwing up numbers, Patrick. I'm trying to hit the lottery. I'm trying to figure out. And then I got drama going on at home. Mom and dad are going through a divorce. So I got all of that going on, the narrative of I'm one of few Blacks, and Mrs. Stone, whatever she was going on that day, a bad day, she decides to shame me in front of the whole class. I internalized that. And what happened whenever as I got older, whenever I was in situations where you or anyone in a team or in a setting, public setting, if you questioned my competence, there was anger.
Yeah.
There was fire. And I never knew the connection there. I never knew. And I also became very driven to show Mrs. Stone that I'll show you that I'm right. I drew the line in the sand, which is also very dangerous. And because whatever we don't talk out, we will act out.
Wow.
Or the pain, the emotion, or the storyline gets buried alive within us. And so that was going on until I had to do my hard work. I sat down with a life coach. I sat down with a therapist, and they began to backtrack and go into my history. And when we got here and they exposed the connection, made the connection, I wept, because I needed to grieve that. I needed to mourn, to move on, because I was so stuck in that narrative and I did not know where it was coming from.
There is this stereotype of Black men being angry Black men.
Yeah.
But if we can look back and draw the line back to what were those initial hurts, what were those initial shames, what were those initial story lies that we're all railing against, you start to understand how the real destructiveness of the words that we use and how we use them, what people say to us. And then you start to really understand the destructiveness of systemic racism, intentional or unintentional.
Very much so. And that's why it always has to start with, I can't control always the narrative of what's happening on the front stage in terms of the systemic racism, but I can control how I show up. I can control how I choose to respond to the behaviors or treatment, or do I decide to buy into the storyline? And I say this too, I make this statement in the book. If you don't know your story, others will write one for you. If we don't know our story, and in addition, Patrick, no one gets the right, R-I-G-H-T, to write, W-R-I-T-E, the Patrick Huey story, the Johnny Parker story. But if we don't write that story, if we're not clear about that story, life will write the story, the culture will write the story, other people will write the story. But if I don't write that story of who I am, what I want, why I want it, someone else will.
The challenge of what you're saying too is that we don't live in isolation. So
Right.
they're already, the stories are written for you based upon your zip code. The stories are written for you based upon where you did or did not go to school, you know, and what kind of job you have. And so it creates even more work and effort and necessity for us to recreate, rewrite, reimagine our own narratives, because we're already born with a set of circumstances that may or may not be for us or be in support of us as we move through our lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There was something else. You talk about your son, Joel, who wanted to pursue a career as a photographer, and then he wanted to be an entrepreneur. And I don't know if you would call it tension, but there was a difference of opinion about how he should proceed with his life, because you really wanted him to follow a more traditional path of education in college, the path that you followed. And then you talk about the process of realizing that by expecting him to follow the same path that you had been on, that you were, in a sense, creating a story lie, a false narrative for him, which I intellectually understand, but I want to know, where is that boundary for the parent and the child, the father and the son, between allowing the child, the son, to pursue their dream and then setting expectations of what you as the parent will or will not fund, will or will not allow in pursuit of his aspirations. So where in this world of creating the storyline and rebutting the story lie do the boundaries of what you would feasibly allow for him to do live?
Absolutely. It was such a breakthrough moment and a big aha moment for me going through that with him, because like you said, I followed a traditional path, and that's what I expected of all my sons. And he was the one who challenged it in a respectful way. He challenged it. He said, "Dad, I love learning. I just don't like school, the way school is set up. I don't understand, why do I got to take courses that have nothing to do with what I want to do? I'm very clear on what I want to do." And he was clear about that at 18. So I think, again, for the parent, it starts with them. It goes back to that meeting thing about me and what's my fear, what's the story that I'm telling myself about this. You know, the story, oh, he's being lazy. he's you know, so I had to be really, really aware of that. So I had to check the box. No, that's not the deal. This kid is motivated. He wants to learn. He loves learning. I get it about taking courses that have nothing to do with his passion and dream. So I think it starts there. First, I got to look at, okay, what's true of my son? What do I know of my son? And it'll probably be on a case-by-case basis in terms of your child. And then realizing, as I looked at many of his peers, because he's a Gen Zer, that this was helpful to see, okay, this is not just me. Other parents are having these conversations, and many Gen Zers have a mindset, as you know, hey, I want to be an entrepreneur. I don't want to have to work for someone. I want to do my own thing. Well, that was new for me, because I didn't come into my sense of dream until I'm in my 30s, but he got it at 18. And so that was helpful, that, okay, this is not just true of Johnny and Joel, you know, Dad and Joel, but this is a narrative that a lot of parents and a lot of kids of his generation. So then I began to sit back and really look at, okay, and ask him this question. Okay, son, what does that look like? What does that look like? Because he was on his way to Duke University. He pulled back and he did a gap year. And that was really, really cool, because he got a chance to travel with me and be exposed to work I do at Hopkins. So that was work with NFL work that I've done. And so he's been Princeton. I lectured at Princeton. He was a part. So he got a really rich gap year experience. And then when he was then when school started for him and he knew he wanted to go into cinematography, then it all made sense. So yeah, I had to wrestle with that, Patrick. That wasn't easy. I was, what are we doing here? This is not the way we do this. But I had to realize that he was very clear about what he wanted, very clear about his dream. And I wasn't raised to dream. I was raised to go get a job, go to college, go in the military, and go to trade school. Those were my four options. And the story has changed. I mean, the culture has changed, and I'm proud of him and many of his generation that are really, really being bold. And how can we be entrepreneurs early in life?
That is the big question, because the whole formation of how we think about society. I mean, we're both Gen Xers, so we were the generation that was taught to go do and achieve as much as you can.
Yeah.
And the dreams may or may not have been important, but what was really important for us was the success.
Right.
And you look at the Gen Zers now, who are much more driven by what makes them light up on the inside. And the
Exactly.
funny thing is that we're all trying to play catch up with that. And they are in many ways there. I mean, yes, they have their own societal pressures and all of that. That's just living on the planet. But it's asking us all, the new zeitgeist is asking us all to go back and say, well, what does light up your heart at night? What does make your heart sing? Go and do that. Which is why I think people have left their jobs in droves, because they're looking for that thing that lights them up.
I think so. You're right. With this great resignation that's going on, I think, and COVID brought that on too, because people are really dying with this, with this pandemic, and people were like, life is short. If I don't go for it now, and then they looked at how their companies responded to them, lack of empathy during that process, and like, really, this is what we are. This is how you're going to treat me, and so people are like, you know what? Now's the time. I've had many friends relocate and move into finding what, as you said, somewhere on the inside, and what lights them up and what makes them come alive, and they are moving towards it. And I think that's a great thing.
Moving towards it unapologetically.
Exactly.
Unapologetically. And that's how you have to move towards something. In the book, you also talk about reaching a point in your career. And you said you were having a very good career, and you were watching the younger people in your profession giving themselves permission to build their own businesses, to take their lives and their careers on their own terms. And you say that was one of your big aha moments, was having to give yourself permission to dream, to act, to change. Can you talk about that moment and what it catalyzed for you?
Yeah, isn't that wild? I mean, here I am now, and it was helpful that all my sons were born. I'm at 30, I'm on 36, my mid 30s. All my sons I have, so they were all born in my 30s. So that was telling, because I began to look at people that were younger and saw that, and many of them that were not Black, they were of other people groups, and I just said, wow, how is this possible? They were younger, they were white, they were Jewish, that's why I saw this, and I started reading books around, okay, how do the Jewish people raise their kids? And I started reading a book called The Jewish Phenomenon that was telling in terms of identity and affirmation, and I didn't get a lot of that growing up. And so I began to really, as I looked at this, come into that place of what does it mean to give myself permission to dream? And the fact that it took 36 years, I was actually angry. Like, why did it take this long? But I'm glad that it caught it before I was 66. So that's when I began raising my sons. That's the sons, being a dad. I raised them to dream, and Joel took it literally. Joel, and all of my sons actually are entrepreneurs. And so he really ran with it. And I was like, wow, I wasn't kidding, but I didn't know it was gonna look like this. So yeah, exactly. So so that affected me. That's when I stepped out and began my business and consulting practice and executive coaching, and just said, you know what, as you said, I'm gonna be unapologetic and go for it.
What was your life like growing up? Because you've mentioned several times, you've referenced your life growing up. What was your life like growing up that planted the seeds to grow, that became where you are now?
Yeah, well, I grew up, my parents divorced when I was young. And and so there was domestic violence, and so I grew up in that context. So I had some trauma, and I didn't realize at the time, and now I knew then, because of how I grew up, I wanted to do work in counseling and therapy. And so I went that track and studied that. And I didn't realize, just when you are experiencing all kinds of trauma, you grow up with these three messages, Patrick: don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. And you have what I call triple A. You can have this shows up this way as well: addictions, abuse, and abandonment. So for me, I had frozen feelings. And that's what happens when you have trauma as your kid, because you don't have the wherewithal to process. You don't have the bandwidth to emotionally and the capacity to process all this stuff. So you have we call frozen feelings. And then hopefully later on and down the road, you start realizing the soundtrack, Mrs. Stone, and all these things that you need. Okay, I need to do my heart work therapist or a life coach. So that I grew up in that, and that's why I tell people, give people hope, because although that's how the story began for me, the way it's ending for my mom and dad, I remarried them 15 years ago.
Wow.
And after 36 years of divorce, I remarried them. And so the story started off horribly, but because they turned the page and began to embrace ownership and humility of how they emotionally injured each other, they now are back together, and the story is ending beautifully.
How do you do it? In one of your sermons, I think it was a sermon, you were at Victory, and I was watching you speak, and you were encouraging the audience to pick up the crosses of the things that were their cross to bear. And I mean, you named it all the way out. You talk about, in those sermons, you talk about that when you can pick up your cross, it becomes your calling. Talk about that, what you really mean by that.
Yeah, that our mess becomes the message, that our pain becomes the purpose. And so I think that's really true. I think that oftentimes, again, I'll use my story, because of how I grew up and what I experienced. I didn't know at the time, obviously at 8, 9 years old, but as life began for me, I began to put some pieces together that, you know what, I really want to help families. I really want to help men and women. I want to help them have better, healthy relationships. And now that's turned into me being, a professor, and same thing, still coaching, executive coaching, keynoting. And I find if you track people, you hear many people will tell you that story. They Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. That mother started that movement because she had a daughter that was killed by a drunk driver. So many movements get started, and people's callings come out of moments of travail and pain and trial. And so as we can embrace it and not stay angry with it, but embrace it, work through it, mourn it, we find that on the other side, that oftentimes become the place of calling and the world's greatest, meeting some of the greatest needs in the world.
Is it possible for the world to do that? I know it's possible for the exceptional to do that, but do we live in a space where people can actually own their mess and make it their message? Is that possible for most people to be able to do that? Is that available to everybody?
I think it is, Patrick, and I talk about that in the Turn the Page book. I call it Demanding Bold Truth, where we take fearless ownership of my challenges and my strengths, because until we own our current story, we can't turn the page to a better story. And so whatever we don't own will own us. And so that's what I talk about, this hard work, heart work stuff. So I do think that's possible. And for a long time, I would always focus on owning the challenges, but I said, you know what? That's challenging, owning your challenges, your issues. But I found for many people in my work, there are people who had a hard time owning their strengths, that they would dumb it down. I would see women, for example, in corporate space and educational spaces, and they would dumb down their brilliance. And because they made the room uncomfortable, they didn't make the room uncomfortable. People in the room felt uncomfortable because of their brilliance. And I would coach these women: don't dumb down your brilliance, because you have others in the room who can't handle your genius. Embrace your genius. Let your light so shine. And so that's an example as well. I found that there are people who needed to embrace their strengths as well as their challenges. And that to me that's Michael Jackson's song. Man in the mirror, woman in the mirror, leader in the mirror, relationship in the mirror. I'm looking for you, make that change. I mean, that's what we're talking about.
We did an interview a few months ago with a woman named Cassandra Worthy, and we talked about, she is a keynote, a CEO of a company called Change Enthusiasm. And she talked about this idea. We were talking about the idea of tokenization and sometimes being the only man, woman, person of color, BIPOC person in a room, and how oftentimes that can make people diminish themselves. And her response was your exact response. She said, you have to let your light shine.
Absolutely, Patrick, because I would feel that. I would feel that many times. I just did a retreat for several leaders in an organization called YPO. You may be familiar with them, Young Presidents Organization. And I was the only, I was the only pepper. I was the only black person, chocolate chip in the room with 7 white guys. And I had to make the decision. I knew what I was walking into. And I walked in that room with confidence, and I was not going to dumb down my brilliance. I was going to let it all hang out and bring my brilliance, bring my excellence, operate from my genius zone unapologetically. But it's taken a long time to get there because I had to turn the page on shame and the story lies that I told myself when I'm in an environment with people who are different from me.
In the acknowledgement of the acknowledgement section of the book, you really recognize your wife. You call her your best friend. And in the book, you talk honestly about you are both very different people and how you had to sort of overcome those differences to build a successful marriage. I think you've been married for almost 30 years now.
Yeah, actually, it'll be 33 in June.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Yes.
And you've done a lot of work in the marriage field. So what, in your estimation, makes a successful marriage union partnership?
Yeah, great question. I really believe so I found this when I did my doctorate, Patrick, that the same dynamics that are true in a great marriage, great relationship are also true in a great organization. So my wife would always say communication, and obviously no one's going to argue with communication. I would say what goes even deeper is humility. I believe humility is the core. Humility and empathy are the core to a great marriage, great leadership, great teams, that I have to have humility, because humility does 2 things. We're imperfect people, and the difference between functional people and healthy people is functional, healthy people versus dysfunctional, unhealthy people. Functional, healthy people take responsibility for their dysfunctional ways. They own their stuff. That's humility. So because we show up in relationships as imperfect people and unconscious biases, I gotta have the humility to own, I apologize for that microaggression. I apologize when someone comes to me. And so that's true in my marriage. My wife points out something to me. Patrick, it's funny. My wife must have put you up to this question because this morning I'm making her smoothie and I'm shaking it in the living room, and I got some curry and not that curry. I have some turmeric in it, and she's getting nervous. Honey, if it opens up, it's going to make a mess over the floor. And I reacted. I mean, it was all respectful, but I began to feel controlled. And so I kept doing it. But that comes up a lot in our relationship. But I'm learning to have empathy, because with empathy, why that matters is because everyone, and you said it in your introduction, all of us at the core want to be heard, seen, and known. And that's empathy. Empathy is that. And so that's what we all want at the core. And because whenever we feel heard, we feel loved. And when we feel loved, it's because we felt heard. And I define that as empathy. So I really believe those 2 qualities are necessary in every human relationship.
When you feel heard, you feel loved.
Exactly.
That's profound.
Yeah. And when we feel loved, oftentimes we felt heard. It's Dr. King's message of a riot is the language of the unheard. And so that's what I think that's what he's getting at as well. And so how do we make this space in a relationship, on a team, where people feel heard and seen and known? Belonging.
Yeah. And in our this season of the show, we're focusing on people who have found or are finding and raising their voices to support their worlds, their communities, our world, our communities. What does that mean for you? Have you found it?
I do. I do feel like I have found it. It's taken many years to find it. but I do. I was just saying that to a friend the other day. I feel more comfortable in my own skin. I know what works. I know what doesn't work. I know what matters to me. I am mindful. I practice a lot of mindfulness and centering breaths every day to keep me focused. And so I feel like I have, and a big change for me. For a long time, the story was very selfish, ambitious story of how does Johnny Parker become great. And that's a nightmare. That's drama. That's mystery. But I realized, moving from a good life to a great life, it's when I make what matters to Patrick and others, or Marianne, Kane, or whoever. How do I make what matters to other people matter? How do I make what matters to you matter to me? That's it. How do I enter into the narrative of a client or a person on social media? That's how we met, and leave them better off than how I found them. When I moved into that narrative, tremendous joy when I realized the power of that. But when the narrative was all about Johnny Parker advancing Johnny Parker, that was a terrible story. That was a nightmare. That was a very selfish story. And that story is not a bestseller.
It's not a bestseller.
No.
Dr. Johnny Parker, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you taking a few minutes to sit down and talk to me.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
And to those of you who are watching or listening, remember, we all have a voice. Use yours wisely. Bye, everyone.